For this video, we will be talking about conditionals. Now, what are conditionals? They're something that create a block or statement which only runs or executes if the statement is true. If it's false, it will be ignored or skipped over. It uses booleans in order to fulfill its true or false statements. A boolean, if you remember, is something that can either be true or false. A conditional uses the keyword if, followed by a boolean expression inside parentheses, followed by a single statement, which is ended with a semicolon, or a block of statements, which is enclosed by a squiggly bracket and another squiggly bracket. Now, it can be seen as something like this. Imagine you had an umbrella, and then the condition was whether or not it was raining. If it is raining, then it is considered true, and you will use the umbrella. If it's not raining, then it will be considered false, and you won't use the umbrella. The umbrella is then considered as the statement or block of statements. The conditional is it raining? And the conditional will only run the statements if it's true and won't if it's false. Now the application can be seen as this. Let me just copy this onto Eclipse. Now, if I run the console, compile it, my bad, it will print out the statements, take an umbrella, and drive carefully. This is because the boolean is true. If it's false, then it won't print out this statement. As you can see here, if the boolean is false, then this statement will be ignored. This is in the format of a statement if block. If statement. Yeah. And it can actually be also done using this format, which is enclosed by these squiggly brackets. Now, as you can see, it will print out the same thing whether or not it's in the statement format or the block format. When it's true, you can see my point. As you can see in the console, it will print out take an umbrella and drive carefully. Now, how do you pick between two conditionals? Well, if you're trying to decide between a couple of things to do, then use an else block. An else block is created by using the keyword else, followed by a statement or a block of statements. Unlike the if block, it does not require a conditional and will run if the prior if block outputs false. If and else block encloses each other. This means that the else block will only pair with an if block if it's directly followed by it. If it's separated by anything, then the else block will not run, and the console will print out an error because the else block is not supposed to be there. You can see my point once I copy this over. If I separate the if block and the else block, then with a line, let's just say system.out.print. Oops, sorry, the Eclipse seems to be hanging. ln Now, as you can see here, it's already underlined in red and will print out errors. This is because if and else block must be following each other. Though the if block doesn't necessitate an else block must necessitate an if block for it to be considered part of the code. As you can see, when it's finally closed off together, else block is now considered not an error. As you can see here, the boolean variable is false. This means that the else block will run. Now, if the if block is to be printed, then you must change this boolean variable into a true statement. Also, you don't actually need to use a variable, or a boolean variable to be exact. You can actually use a boolean expression. This means, say, if 0 is equal to 0, then you can actually do the same thing. This is a true statement. Now, if I say 0 is equal to 1, then it will actually print out false, and the else statement will run. Now, what happens if you need to use more than two options? Well, you're going to use an else-if block. An else-if block is a special case in Java. It has to be after an if statement or an if block and doesn't have to be enclosed by an else block, but if it exists, then it does. Now, an else-if block acts kind of like an else block and also kind of like an if block. It acts like an else block because it runs only if the prior if or else if blocks are false. However, it also requires a conditional like the if block and will only run if this conditional proves true, and it will be ignored if the conditional proves false. Now, in order to create an else-if block, you proceed kind of like an if block. You follow the same format, however, you place an else keyword right before the if keyword. An important thing to note that many beginners fail to recognize is that multiple if blocks followed by an else block is not the same thing as one if block followed by multiple else-if blocks followed by an else block. Now, the reason why is that an if block will run right after an if block. However, an else-if block will only run if the prior if block or else-if block are false. This means that every condition will be checked if you have multiple if blocks, but only one condition will be checked if the if block is true, or multiple if the preceding conditions are false. Now, when you're using an else-if block, you don't actually need to use an else block. You only need to use the else block if you want to use, say, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8, say, conditions. However, if you're using just 2 and you want the second conditional to only run if the condition is true, then just use an else-if block. However, if you want the second conditional to run, whether or not it is, like no matter what, then use an else block. Now, let me just copy this over to Eclipse. Nope. Now, as you can see in this block of statements, is that the variable is not actually a Boolean variable. This is because you want to use more than 2 conditions, and a Boolean variable will only limit you to 2, true or false. Now, if you use, say, an integer in order to check whether or not it's less than, equal to, or more than 0, then use, say, an integer. Now, if this is equal to 0, then we'll print out x is 0 because of this statement. However, if, say, it is -1, then we'll print out x is negative, and if it's 1, then we'll print out x is positive. Now, if you just want to do whether or not x is positive or negative, then you can do something like this, where instead of having an else block, you can also run x is positive. Now, if x is 1, oh, sorry, I forgot to change the conditional as well. Now, if this is positive, then we'll print out positive. If it's negative, then we'll print out negative. However, the glory of using an else-if block rather than an else block in a 2-condition, say, like pair, is that it actually can be ignored if it proves that both statements are false. Again, you can also use the block format. I just choose to use the statement format as such. Now, what happens if you want to use more than one condition in one conditional statement? Well, you're going to use an AND expression, this thing right here. To do this, if I can repeat the same code. Hold on. Now, you can actually do something like this. If x is less than 0 and x is less than -5, then you can say x is negative and less than -5. Else if x is less than 0, then system.out.println x is negative and more than -5. Oops. Now, if I run this code, then it'll print out x is negative and more than -5. This is because, as we can see here, it is not less than -5, so it must be more than, which is why I did this. As you can see here, it must both be true in order for this to run, and if it's not, then the preceding blocks will follow. Now you can also do something similar, except replacing the AND with an OR. This is through using this expression. This is actually just two lines put together. So replacing this with this, and saying x is negative now will print out so that if x is less than -5, then if x is less than -5 or x is less than 0, then we'll print out x is negative, as you can see right here. Something else that I failed to note earlier is that you can actually use more than two conditions. This is done by using just another OR statement or another AND statement, as you can see right here. Now if we do this like so, then we'll print out x is negative as well. Another piece of code just to express this point further. Oh, oops. Now, an important concept to note that follows this +1 condition conditionals is short-circuit evaluation. Now, what is short-circuit evaluation? Well, it's something that Java does in order for it to run faster and more smoothly. What it does, in specifics, is that it actually ignores the rest of the conditions if it only has to check one condition in order for the result to be the same. Now, this is done in the AND and the OR statements. In the AND expression, it won't have to check the rest of the conditions if the first condition is false, because all of the conditions must be true in order for the block to run. In the OR expression, it won't have to check for the rest of the conditions if the first condition is true, because only one condition must be true in order for the block to run. And that about wraps it up for the rest of this video.